Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, throughout the course of our lives, we all have to make many important decisions that will help define our legacy. What do we want to study in college? What do we want to do for a living? Should we have children or not? And if so, what kind of world should we leave behind for them? How do we plan for our retirement? These are some of the many big decisions we all have to make during our time in this world. But perhaps the most important decision anyone will ever be faced with is how they decide to fight the slaphead curse. When it comes to saving our hair, the only viable solution is to use a 5-AR inhibiting drug, and there are two choices a person can make in that regard. They can either decide to become a finasteride peasant, or they can join the Dutasteride master race. Whichever path you endeavor on, you can rest assured that both options are completely viable, and both finasteride and dutasteride are extremely effective treatments that will stop and reverse hair loss in the vast majority of people. However, there's no question that dutasteride is the more efficacious drug amongst the two, and despite its improved potency, it still has a similar safety profile to finasteride. That makes dutasteride the 5-AR inhibitor of choice for those who prefer the finer things in life, hence why its users are known as the Dutasteride master race. However, what is less known within the lore of hair loss witchery is that amongst the Dutasteride master race, there exists a master race even amongst the master race. You see, both finasteride and dutasteride are typically prescribed in a standard dose. With finasteride, the standard dose is 1 milligram per day, which will suppress about 40% of scalp DHT. Now, that may not sound like all that much, but that is still enough scalp DHT suppression to stop hair loss in the vast majority of people. The standard dose of dutasteride is 0.5 milligrams per day, which suppresses about 50% of scalp DHT. This is what makes dutasteride objectively superior to finasteride at stopping and reversing hair loss. But what if we could go beyond the standard dose? Could we suppress even more DHT? Well, in the case of finasteride, the answer is unfortunately no. Finasteride has diminishing returns after 1 milligram, so that even when it is taken at 5 milligrams per day, it doesn't really suppress any more DHT than just 1 milligram per day, nor does going up to 5 milligrams per day increase hair regrowth compared to 1 milligram per day. But dutasteride, on the other hand, doesn't have that limitation. In the case of dutasteride, using more of the drug than the standard dose will indeed produce superior outcomes. So, for those hair loss witchers who are so exalted that even the dutasteride master race will not placate their hatred for the trash hormone DHT, there exists the 2.5 milligram dutasteride exalted race amongst the master race. Amazingly, dutasteride, when used at 5 times the standard dose, will suppress almost 30% more scalp DHT than 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride. This is so much DHT suppression that the progression of androgenetic alopecia will become virtually, if not completely impossible. However, this is an incredibly potent treatment that is probably overkill in anybody except for those who have the most aggressive forms of androgenetic alopecia, such as those who have diffuse thinning or retrograde alopecia patterns that started in their teenage years. It is a good option, though, for those who want to have the ultimate reassurance that they'll never have to suffer the horrible fate of having to shave the toilet seat-shaped ring around their head every day just so they could be yet another left-swiped, bald, and bearded clone. However, before considering whether to take the glorious leap to a 2.5 milligram dose of dutasteride, it's important to know what the actual research is on that dose. Even if 2.5 milligrams per day is more effective, is it actually safe for us to use? Well, admittedly, chooms, there is less research available on using a 2.5 milligram dose of dutasteride than 0.5 milligrams. That's because the first dutasteride studies, just like the first finasteride studies, were for treating prostate enlargement, not hair loss. These prostate studies used a dose of 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride per day. Later, when studies were done on using dutasteride for hair loss, the same dose was chosen for most of these studies. But despite this, since we know for a fact that dutasteride, unlike finasteride, doesn't peak at the standard dose, there is some research on using a dose of 2.5 milligrams per day. And believe it or not, we have research where doses even higher than 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride were used. First of all, based on the first phase 1 studies of dutasteride, we know that dutasteride is a very safe drug, possibly even safer than finasteride, and I say that as a finasteride peasant myself. It is also remarkable that there are actually no reports of toxicity from overdoses of dutasteride in the medical literature, even when used at extremely high doses. In the initial studies done on healthy volunteers, single doses of up to 40 milligrams per day of dutasteride taken for a week caused no safety concerns whatsoever. In other studies, daily doses of 5 milligrams per day were given to 60 subjects for 6 months, and there was no increase in adverse effects compared to taking the standard dose of 0.5 milligrams per day. So, we know dutasteride is safe, of course, even when it is megadosed, but we also know it is extremely effective at stopping hair loss. We have some high-quality studies looking at the effect of different doses of dutasteride on both serum and scalp DHT levels, as well as hair growth. One of the first studies that looked at different dutasteride doses is this one here from 2004. In the study, 399 men with benign prostatic hyperplasia, also known as BPH, received doses of dutasteride ranging from 0.01 milligrams per day up to 5 milligrams per day. Besides the dutasteride groups, there was also a group that took 5 milligrams of finasteride per day and a placebo control group. This figure here shows the amount of serum DHT suppression in the different groups. As you can see, finasteride marked with the letter F doesn't suppress as much serum DHT as 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride. 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride suppresses a little more serum DHT than 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride, but you can also see that the curve really flattens out at 2.5 milligrams per day, and it doesn't look like 5 milligrams a day of dutasteride really does anything more than just 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. If you look at the actual numbers, you can see that 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride suppress serum DHT levels by about 95%, and both 2.5 milligrams and 5 milligrams of dutasteride suppressed it by about 98%. So again, not a huge difference, but definitely better than finasteride, which suppressed serum DHT by 70%. As far as adverse events went, there was no evidence that increasing the dose of dutasteride increased the risk of adverse events. The only exception was altered libido, which was higher in the dutasteride 5 milligrams per day group. However, I want to emphasize here that altered libido does not necessarily mean lowered libido. An altered libido could also very well mean a higher libido, and indeed, there are a lot of people who report that dutasteride raised their libido, sometimes dramatically. Personally speaking, I have heard far more people tell me that they've had increased libido from dutasteride rather than decreased libido, and I can definitely relate to that. You see, I actually used to use dutasteride. I don't anymore because I couldn't justify using it as a vegan since it contains gelatin soft gels, which are an animal product, but when I was on dutasteride, it made me insanely horny, which was a terrible thing for me at the time because I was single. So dutasteride actually gave me a side effect, although for many people, the boost in libido may be seen as a good thing just so long as you're dating a nymphomaniac. But getting back to the study, keep in mind that this was a study of BPH subjects, not hair loss subjects, but we do have another study here that specifically looked at different doses of dutasteride for treating hair loss. In this randomized control trial, 416 men with androgenetic alopecia were treated with doses of dutasteride ranging from 0.05 milligrams per day to 2.5 milligrams per day. The study also included a group taking 5 milligrams of finasteride per day and a placebo control group. The study lasted for 24 weeks, and it actually looked not only at serum DHT levels like the last study did, but also at scalp DHT levels, which of course is what's actually important for us hair loss sufferers. The study also assessed hair growth using hair counts. Looking at hair counts, not surprisingly, dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day gave the best results, followed by dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day. Both doses of dutasteride were better than 5 milligrams per day of finasteride, so there's no doubt about it. Dutasteride is the most effective treatment for hair loss. Looking at serum DHT levels, the results were very similar to what was seen in the last study. 0.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride decreased serum DHT levels by 92%, while 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride decreased it by 96%. 0.1 milligram of dutasteride taken daily decreased serum DHT levels by 70%, and 5 milligrams per day of finasteride decreased it by 73%. So finasteride at 5 milligrams per day was roughly equivalent to dutasteride at 0.1 milligram per day. If you look at scalp DHT levels, 0.5 2.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride decreased it by 51%, and that was compared to finasteride, which decreased it by 41%. However, if we look at 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride, it decreased scalp DHT by a whopping 79%. Looking at this figure here, you can see how the amount of suppression of scalp DHT correlated very well with the amount of hair growth. This is, of course, definitive evidence that hair loss in androgenetic alopecia is directly related to the levels of DHT in the scalp. So the more scalp DHT you suppress, the more hair regrowth you get. So looking at adverse events, there was no statistically significant difference in the incidence of adverse events in the treatment groups versus the placebo groups. However, I have to note that in this table here, it does seem like there were slightly more cases of reduced libido in the 2.5 milligram group of dutasteride than the other groups. The investigators make note of this in their paper, and they emphasize that this side effect was at worst mild to moderate. Like with all other 5-AR inhibiting drugs though, the side effects usually resolved while the subjects were still continuing the medication, which was what was seen in the finasteride clinical trials too. So that's why I always tell you, chums, that if you do get side effects from a 5-AR inhibitor, don't panic, because they'll likely go away in a month or two if you muscle through them. And I'd say the same thing to someone who was taking 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. And if you want more advice about how to handle the side effects from 5-AR inhibitors, I'll go ahead and link my side effects video below. So the investigators in this study concluded that dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day was a better treatment for hair loss than finasteride. In fact, they even seem to be recommending that 2.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride should be the standard dose for treating hair loss instead of 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride. And I have to be honest, chums, I'm inclined to agree with them. I mean, after all, why do most hair loss sufferers use dutasteride to begin with? It is usually because they want something more powerful than finasteride, and even though 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride already is more powerful than finasteride, if we can have an even more powerful version of that drug that has almost the exact same safety profile, then it seems pretty logical to me that 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride should be the standard dose instead of 0.5 milligrams, and people should be able to have easy access to a treatment like that without having to swallow 5 dutasteride capsules per day. However, despite how incredibly effective 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride is, most subsequent studies on the drug have looked at just 0.5 milligrams per day as the standard dose of dutasteride. Despite that, there are still some other studies that looked at the effects of 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. Here's one from 2009. It's from Japan, and most of the article is actually written in Japanese, but fortunately, I do have a good working relationship with the Science Patrol, which is located in Tokyo, and they were kind enough to decode this article for me. This is a study of 284 men with benign prostatic hyperplasia who are randomized to receive dutasteride at doses of 0.05, 0.5, or 2.5 milligrams daily. The dutasteride groups were compared to a placebo control group. The study lasted for 24 weeks. In the study, dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day reduced serum DHT levels by 90%, which was about the same as was seen with a dose of 0.5 milligrams per day. Unfortunately, in this study, the investigators did not measure scalp DHT levels, although that does make sense since this was a study about men with benign prostatic hyperplasia instead of hair loss. However, we know from the data I already presented that dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day suppressed almost 30% more scalp DHT than just 0.5 milligrams, even though 2.5 milligrams only increases serum DHT suppression by a few percentage points over 0.5 milligrams per day. Overall, though, there were fewer adverse effects with dutasteride versus placebo, but most of the adverse effects in this table weren't even related to the drug. However, there was a 6% incidence of erectile dysfunction with both 0.5 milligrams and 2.5 milligrams daily of dutasteride, as opposed to only 1% incidence with placebo. I think that's a pretty low incidence considering dutasteride's tremendous benefits, but what I found really interesting about this study is that if we look specifically at sexual side effects, it looks like, if anything, there were fewer sexual side effects from the 2.5 milligram dose versus the 0.5 milligram dose, even though 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride suppresses 30% more scalp DHT. So I can already hear DHT simps saying, "Oh, but DHT is so important for libido. It is the ultimate, most masculine, most supreme hormone in all of existence, and silence!" Sorry, DHT cells, but this study proves that you are wrong. If DHT were an essential hormone, then suppressing more of it would cause more side effects, but it doesn't. And that's why Dutasteride doesn't have more side effects than Finasteride, and 2.5 milligrams of Dutasteride doesn't have more side effects than 0.5 milligrams of Dutasteride, at least not to any significant degree. Testosterone is the main male hormone, not DHT. And while we're on that topic, let's go over the next study. This one here. This was actually a study to see if blocking the production of DHT would interfere with strength training when men were given supplemental testosterone injections. There were 139 men who were given either 2.5 milligrams a day of Dutasteride or a placebo. The men then got injections of testosterone and enanthate for over 20 weeks. The results of the study showed that Dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day did not interfere in any way with the response to testosterone. The investigators looked at many parameters like fat-free body mass, fat mass, chest strength, and leg strength. The men in the study were able to increase their strength gains with testosterone regardless of whether or not they were on 2.5 milligrams a day of Dutasteride. By using a high dose of Dutasteride, there was a blockade of both the type 1 and type 2 5-AR isoenzymes. As you can see from this figure here, serum testosterone levels increased with increasing doses of testosterone and enanthate. However, in the subjects on Dutasteride, serum DHT levels remained suppressed. In the study, the incidence of side effects was comparable between the Dutasteride group and the placebo group. So just think about that for a second, chums. DHT simps like to tell us that DHT is a critical hormone for male virility, yet in this study, subjects who were using Dutasteride, a drug that literally suppresses 90% of serum DHT, had the same incidence of side effects as the placebo group. If this study instead used subjects who were put on a drug that suppressed testosterone levels by 90% and then compared it to a placebo, do you really think that the incidence of side effects would be the same? That's a rhetorical question, of course, but what the most important finding from this study is that unlike what DHT simps like to claim, DHT is not at all important for muscle or strength. It does literally nothing. The investigators concluded, quote, changes in fat-free mass in response to graded testosterone doses did not differ in men in whom DHT was suppressed by Dutasteride from those treated with placebo, indicating that conversion of testosterone to DHT is not essential for mediating its anabolic effects on muscle, unquote. Also, this study is more evidence that Dutasteride, even when it's taken at 2.5 milligrams per day, is very well tolerated in most people, just like 0.5 milligrams of Dutasteride is. That already is very convincing evidence, but we're not done yet, hair loss switchers. Let me bring up a few more studies. This one here from 2014 is another Dutasteride dose-ranging study for treating hair loss. However, the study just used Dutasteride doses of 0.02 milligrams, 0.1 milligrams, and 0.5 milligrams per day, as well as Finasteride at 1 milligram per day. A dose of 2.5 milligrams per day was not included in the study. However, this is a pretty big study, including 917 men who were treated over 24 weeks. As you can see from the results, the higher the Dutasteride dose, the better the increase in hair counts. Comparing Finasteride at 1 milligram per day to Dutasteride, it looks like Finasteride is about equal in efficacy to 0.1 milligrams per day of Dutasteride, which is consistent with the earlier study I quoted. So, looking at the incidence of adverse effects, the overall incidence was similar in all the groups, including the placebo group. When looking specifically at sexual side effects, again, there was no evidence of an increasing incidence related to the Dutasteride dose. The investigators note that, quote, the incidence of adverse events of special interest related to sexual functioning and breast disorders was similar in the active treatment groups and lower with placebo, with the composite adverse event altered libido being the main cause for the difference between placebo and active treatments, unquote. The most important conclusion from this study, though, is that there was no evidence of increasing side effects with increasing doses of Dutasteride. This was also the conclusion of this study published just this year from Egypt. The study was a systemic review of dose-ranging studies of Dutasteride compared to Finasteride for the treatment of hair loss, and it included 9 different studies. The study concluded that both Dutasteride at a dose of 0.5 milligrams per day and at a dose of 2.5 milligrams per day were superior to Finasteride at a dose of 1 milligram per day in improving hair counts. The investigators also concluded that the incidence of adverse events was equivalent amongst all the different doses of the treatment arms, meaning there was no increased incidence of side effects when going from 0.5 milligrams milligrams per day of dutasteride to 2.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride. So apart from a few very small studies unrelated to hair loss, that's pretty much all the data on using dutasteride at a dose of 2.5 milligrams per day or higher. Adding together all the subjects in these different trials, there have been approximately 400 subjects closely studied who had received doses of 2.5 milligrams a day of dutasteride or even higher doses without any evidence of any significant toxicity. So even though this data is limited and the studies are short-term, I think there are several conclusions that could be made here. Number one, dutasteride even at 0.5 milligrams per day is superior to finasteride at 1 milligram per day in treating hair loss. Number two, dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day increases the suppression of serum DHT by a few percentage points compared with 0.5 milligrams per day, but it has a much greater effect on scalp DHT suppression than 0.5 milligrams per day. It decreases scalp DHT by another 30%, and there is data that this extra DHT suppression increases hair counts more than dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day. However, going above 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride per day probably doesn't add much in terms of efficacy. Number three, most of the data indicates that increasing doses of dutasteride does not cause increasing incidence of side effects. So if you want to max out scalp DHT suppression, 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride a day is definitely the way to go. However, for many people, this dose is unnecessary and pretty impractical. Practically speaking, 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride has its drawbacks. Dutasteride capsules do not come in a 2.5 milligram size, so it would be necessary to take 5 capsules per day, which would be pretty expensive. It might also be difficult to convince your doctor that this is a good idea, although if you are going to try it, then I would recommend talking to a hair transplant surgeon. In my experience, hair transplant surgeons are generally much more liberal about writing prescriptions for dutasteride, especially if they think that you may buy a transplant from them in the near future. It may also be possible to get a compounding pharmacy to make 2.5 milligram capsules of dutasteride, although I've never heard of this happening. So as amazing as 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride is, I don't think it is necessary for most people. 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride or even 1 milligram of finasteride will still stop hair loss in the vast majority of people, but I do still think that 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride is very useful for some special cases. Like I said at the beginning of the video, people with diffuse thinning or retrograde alopecia, or people who have very aggressive hair loss in the typical Norwood pattern that started at a young age, like in their teen years, they could really benefit from 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. I have to be honest though, when people tell me that they're losing ground on finasteride and especially on dutasteride, I'm usually pretty skeptical. I think most of them haven't given the treatment enough time and they're just panicking about a treatment shed or a seasonal shed. But if you are using finasteride or 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride and you are absolutely convinced that you are losing ground, or maybe you just want the extra reassurance that a more potent version of the drug will give you, then 2.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride is the ultimate treatment for hair loss that will stop the slaphead curse no matter how extreme your hair loss may be. So if I were to pander to anime fans, I'd say that 2.5 milligrams per day of dutasteride is the Super Saiyan Blue of hair loss treatments. It isn't necessary for most of us, but it is definitely a comforting thought knowing that this treatment exists. Okay, hair loss witchers, I think that's it for today, so I'll see you all soon with some more preem content. Thank you for watching. God bless.